Next is Lost Labyrinth Zone Act 2. If I am not mistaken, this is the reason why the game got delayed. Basically, because of its roots as Sonic the Portable, it basically tried to have, like, tilt controls. So I want to say there's like some kind of minecart stage that entirely relies on tilt controls, and basically it didn't really work with traditional controls. It probably would have been fine on Wii of all platforms, but not necessarily the other two. I also feel like that's why the special stages work the way they do, where you tilt the stage and not Sonic, unlike in Sonic 1, because of its iPhone roots, essentially. I'll be honest, I don't like this stage at all, so I almost would have preferred the iPhone version, even without having ever played it. We have tons of darkness, and we have to light torches, and also light dynamite to clear a path. Basically, please do your best to stick to the top route of the stage, because if you fall at all, you will have a miserable time with the stage on the first playthrough. At least I have had a miserable time whenever I try to go through the stage after a long absence of playing this game and not remembering what I'm supposed to do. I actually had to look it up before this playthrough. We do have some minecart action here, but again, I do feel like it is kept to a minimum compared to what I understand what it was like in the iPhone version. But yeah, it is actually interesting to borrow the aesthetics of something like Labyrinth, but not the gameplay, because we really don't have anything that reminiscent of Labyrinth in terms of gameplay, because we didn't really see much water so far. That is a long drop, and again, it's because I can't see anything, so again, it's very interesting level design having so many blind jumps all over the place. So again, not my favorite thing, but that's just kind of a staple of Dimps' level design, unfortunately. I think I actually did fall enough that we will have to go through a bit of a puzzle, which I'm not exactly excited about. So you might notice that lighting some of the torches causes blocks to move up. So basically there's a really notorious torch sequence where you have to light a series of torches in a specific order, or else you'll lock yourself out from progression. So it's very particular, and again, I was really hoping I would stay on the top path long enough to avoid it, so we'll see if we actually did dodge it or not. In general, I also feel like the music isn't awful, but I feel like it would have been better to not try to sound like a Genesis game. This was done by Jun Sonoe, who did the adventure games, for example, and I do feel like he does really good work, but a lot of times his Genesis sounding work tends to be a little bit exaggerated. I know the Genesis has a very distinct sound to it, but I almost feel like it goes a little bit overboard sometimes in terms of like how chiptune-y it can feel. I don't know if I set that up correctly. I think that was correct, I just messed up the timing of the jump. So we basically want to light the fourth torch, and then wait, and then light the third torch a little bit later, and that should be good? Again, I had to look this up. So actually, I think I need to actually light the third torch slightly later than I actually did, like that. And maybe... okay, that wasn't fast enough. Again, this is why I was hoping to avoid this, which again, I think is possible if you manage to stay on the upper path of this zone. Again, if you can avoid this, it'll definitely save you a lot of headache. So that's the third torch there. So yeah, basically, let's try this again. Light that one, wait, and then light this one, then hurry over. But again, it's such a particular timing puzzle because you have to have the one torch lit enough to actually jump over, but you also have to have the other torch go out for this block to move before the actual platform falls. I seriously feel like I'm doing something wrong, but I think this is actually correct. I think the timing is just that particular, where if you're just slightly off with your timing, everything goes wrong, and that's really unfortunate. Yeah, like that would have worked if I had made it to the block in time, but I just wasn't able to hop up in time. Now we have to wait for the third torch to go out. So yeah, just basically figuring out the amount of spacing you need to actually light this and have enough time to hop over. I messed the jump. I really don't like the homing attack in this game. I don't know if it's the controller I'm using, but I feel like it's really easy for the game to misread the homing attack, or misread one A press as two, and then you end up homing attacking and falling into a void. So that was part of my problem, is I kept accidentally performing the homing attack. But we're past that. That is like my least favorite part of Sonic 4 actually, in terms of like level design. There's one thing I actually don't like. We'll see that in a bit, but we don't have to deal with that right away, so I'll save my thoughts for a little bit later. We did have one torch there, but I think we have to light this one. Yep, there we go, and we should be good to go. To tell the truth, the last time I tried to play this game, I actually gave up at this act, so I don't fully remember what the gimmick of Act 3 was, just because this is as far as I got on my last attempt at practicing for this playthrough, actually. So we're kind of winging it from here on out. I've only played this game all the way through one time, so this will be my second playthrough, actually. So that's a lot of TNT. I am not sure if this is a case where we have to light a specific one, and if we light the wrong one, we'll be in trouble, so we'll only light that one and move on. Again, the level design is actually pretty clever in some cases, but just really annoying in other ways. Again, that's why I find it really fascinating, where in some ways this game feels incredibly uninspired, but actually does introduce, occasionally, some pretty unique gimmicks. In general, I also miss having other characters as well. We only have Sonic in this game, which is kind of a bummer as someone who often ends up playing as Tails instead in other Sonic games. And flight would actually help a lot, especially with so many pits that you may or may not be able to see when you're landing. Being able to like slowly descend would actually be kind of nice. And now we're back into the darkness, which is not great given that we're in a minecart and it's probably going to be a last-minute jump that we have trouble avoiding, or maybe not. That was actually a lot more straightforward than I thought it would be. This is very Donkey Kong Country, actually. I assume we're getting close to the end of the stage because we're at 7 minutes. That's pretty long, actually, for a classic Sonic level. Judging by the act title, I spoke too soon about Labyrinth Zone, because it does feel like we're going to be dealing with some water here. So we have a water slide. I assume they're going to pull the same trick as Sonic 1, where you have to like jump off at a specific time, or maybe not. We got a life though. We have plenty of lives, which is good, because I'm a little bit worried about specifically the final boss, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. In general, again, I do feel like Sonic 4 is a relatively straightforward game. There are definitely some annoying challenges, though it could also just be because I've played it before, so I'm not like... I'm sort of somewhat aware of the level design, also because I've played other DIMP Sonic games, so I'm kind of used to some of the gimmicks they put in, and some of the weird tricks they do to sort of artificially increase the difficulty. At least we have iframes, so that's nice. You never know in Sonic if you'll actually have like a decent amount of iframes after taking damage. That's actually one of my issues with Sonic Frontiers, is the lack of iframes. So when you take damage, it's very easy to get essentially stun-locked for a long period of time. So here we have to tilt the stage to pop out that block in order to drain the water. Again, there are definitely some tells, specifically with Episode 1, that this was definitely not meant for console. This was definitely meant for phones, where you can actually physically tilt to stir up the water like that. Now, here's the little water slide thing I was expecting earlier, where we have to carefully jump off the slide with proper timing to actually make it forward. So again, it's kind of interesting. You have some unique gimmicks, but then they also just reuse some mechanics. And now we have the crushy wall, kind of like in a few zones actually, but the one I was thinking of was Hydro City. Why couldn't I remember Hydro City? That's like the most memorable Sonic name because of how everyone argues over it. Yeah, it's very much like the wall in Hydro City. So yeah, it's basically incorporating a ton of gimmicks from a few different classic Sonic games in very interesting ways. But again, as far as like the torch sequence, I feel like that's the only like puzzly section in Episode 1 from what I recall, so we should be okay from here on out. I saw the fish kind of going through that wall, so I assumed there'd be a shortcut there. Yeah, it's very interesting actually, how many Sonic games actually were worked on by Dimps in terms of like this era of Sonic game where Sega directly hasn't made a 2D Sonic game, I'm pretty sure, since the Game Gear. It might be Sonic Blast, as depressing as that statement might be. This is being recorded before the release of Origins Plus, so I'll just say I'm really curious to see how people react to games like Sonic Blast in particular because of how not great that game is. I am not sure what happened there. Oh, there are spikes there, so you have to be a little bit careful when actually tilting to avoid getting clipped by the spikes. Yeah, this isn't great. This little puzzle here, I guess you could call it that. So we have to carefully tilt like this so we don't hit the spikes. I hope that's... no. Well, let's try this again. You know, I was thinking that we were past the worst of it, and yet this game sometimes finds ways to surprise you. Here we go. At least, again, if there's one thing I can give Dimps some credit for, even though this isn't exactly high praise, it's that a lot of times if there is going to be something cheap in a Dimps level, at least they'll put a checkpoint before it, which at least is some slight courtesy there. There we go, you have to kind of rock back and forth. I didn't remember that the block moved when you did that as well. We have another slide here, so we just have to kind of figure out the right path. Yeah, in general, I feel like the music isn't bad, but it also just is extraordinarily unmemorable, which is almost worse in some ways, to just be kind of bland. But again, that's kind of my interesting takeaway with Sonic Force. It's almost fascinating, and it's sort of unoriginality is almost what makes it interesting, because of having so many examples of nostalgia in Sonic games. And again, this was kind of the start of it, where a lot of Sonic games from here on out rely on classic throwbacks. And we've made it to the boss, which, if I'm not mistaken, is kind of like the Labyrinth Zone boss, where it's kind of like a chase. Let's dodge the enemy, carefully climb up. I hope there's less, like, fire and spikes here. That'd be nice, but knowing this game, I can't exactly count on that, to be honest. I actually do feel like there aren't any, like, flamethrowers, which is different from Sonic 1, which had the little fire shooters, which honestly were really annoying, so I can't complain that there aren't any here. Yeah, this is better than Labyrinth, which isn't exactly high praise, to be fair. You might have noticed also I barely used the spin dash, and that's because it's not great in this game. You end up losing momentum very easily with the spin dash, so a lot of times it's easier to just roll, or like, just kind of run fast enough to build up speed slowly. Do we actually have a boss here? I actually didn't remember if we did or not. Here we go. This is actually kind of reminding me a little bit of the one water level in 2, the name of which I'm not remembering at this time, but where you have to use the pillars. I got a little greedy there, so unfortunately that means we have to go through this entire section again. Again, luckily though, it's not nearly as bad as the Labyrinth climb, which is just awful. I can imagine doing that on Sonic Genesis, which is the GBA version, and released the same day as Sonic 06, by the way. But yeah, I seriously question how someone would get through the Labyrinth Zone climb with that much slowdown, because even without water, that game slows down constantly, so I feel like that would be incredibly impressive if anyone could actually do that. I'm sure someone has. Like, I wonder if there are any speedrunners for specifically the GBA version, and if so, why? Because, like, why would you put yourself through that? But again, I guess if you were good enough to get a record like that, it would actually be a very easy record to get and hold, because you're not going to have a whole lot of competition in a Sonic 1 GBA category. So what did I do wrong? Okay, this time it's different. We have horizontal moving objects. Okay, I see how it is. We basically have to wait for... There's basically going to be one safe spot to actually stand, and we have to aim for that. So, attempt number 3... I really wish there was a checkpoint past the climb. I guess maybe that would make it a little too easy, I suppose. But also rings are kind of useless after the climb because nothing can actually hurt you. It's only damage from squashing, which doesn't count rings anyway. So yeah, you don't really need rings much here. Unlike in Labyrinth, where it's mostly just to survive. I don't think you even have to defeat Eggman in Labyrinth. It's just a matter of survival, basically. Though, to be fair, that's a good enough challenge in its own right, so I do feel like that isn't necessarily a bad decision not having to actually fight Eggman and defeat him during the climb. I almost feel like the horizontal moving pillars would be easier to deal with, so I'm kind of hoping for that again. It's kind of looking like it's a very nice pattern there, because it just basically closed in where Eggman was, meaning we didn't actually have to worry about much. Yeah, it's basically a reaction time fight, which isn't great. As I was saying, it isn't great to have a fight based around reaction time when you have this much slowdown. Not slowdown, but like input lag, basically. Like sometimes it just feels like inputs don't read properly because of Sonic just generally, the physics just generally feeling not that good. So I almost feel like that's making this a lot harder than it should be, just because I keep running into problems. I don't even think I'm surviving the climb this time, because of getting hit that many times. We'll try, but I'm not feeling overly optimistic about this. Maybe? Barely. Again, spin dash through here, and make it up these steps to the top. I feel like I'm not overly shocked that this is a boss I'm having trouble with. If any boss was going to give me trouble, I guess it would make sense for the Labyrinth-esque one too. And there's one more boss later on that I'm very, very worried about, so I can't say I'm looking forward to that. But at the very least I remember that fight more. Part of my problem here was I just didn't remember this, to be honest. Yeah, basically having a fight built around reaction time, but with the controls being as mushy feeling as they are, it ends up making it a lot more strict than it should be, just because you're having to hope that you don't, like, accidentally homing attack, for example. I'm going to play this safe because I've died so many times already. Not going to take too many risks. Again, the horizontal ones actually give you more chances to actually deal damage. Eggman's going into that corner, which is interesting. Okay, that's an interesting pattern there, but we were able to get a hit, thankfully. Again, in classic games in particular, I never know whether to call him Eggman or Robotnik. I feel like for a game called Sonic 4, it should be Eggman, or it should be Robotnik, but he clearly has his Eggman sign, so it's very confusing. That took way more tries than I hoped it would, but we got through it. Our penultimate zone is Mad Gear Zone, which again is one of those where I'm like, this is a choice to bring back an aesthetic that sort of feels reminiscent a little bit of Metropolis. I feel like certain parts of the stage feel more like Metropolis than others. I mean, we have the slicers and the crab enemies, so that's not exactly great as someone who doesn't really like those enemies. I feel like Sonic 2 kind of has a problem with these enemies in particular of just not having a skill set to deal with enemies that can outrange you, basically. Like, with the slicers, what are you supposed to do about them? Because they're able to, like, throw their little boomerang claws so far, and you're barely able to do anything. You just have to kind of take a hit, and that's why I really don't like getting the Chaos Emeralds in classic Sonic 2. It's tolerable in Origins with enough, like, you know, reloads of checkpoints, and, just having more opportunities to get Chaos Emeralds because of just having a more forgiving version than the classic. We also have the little star enemies as well. So yeah, this is basically trying to be Metropolis, which again, given that's one of the most maligned zones in Sonic 2, that's a decision. And again, this is why I was like, I am not worried about Chaos Emeralds, because I cannot hold on to rings in this stage at all. Hypothetically, if you were to try to get the Chaos Emeralds, I'd highly recommend getting them before here, because there is the world map where you can choose other levels. I'd also recommend specifically going to levels that aren't this to actually get the emeralds, because with 3 acts per zone, you could get them by the end of Lost Labyrinth, basically. And that would be preferable, or actually the beginning of Lost Labyrinth, and that would be preferable than trying to hold on to 50 rings long enough in a stage that's basically a death trap, which, I mean, it's effective. It's like, Eggman's got a point with making a level this dangerous, because it is very effective at killing Sonic, but from like a player experience, I feel like it's just very unforgiving. I'm almost surprised, actually, that Sonic 4 Episode 1 draws so much from Sonic 2, actually, because again, it's like you have 2 zones from 1 and 2 zones from 2. I'm actually surprised, given the Episode 1 moniker, that it wasn't more like focused on just Sonic 1 and had like Episode 2 be more focused on like borrowing from Sonic 2. But again, this is kind of like a merge of the first two, and then CD and 3 get nothing in Episode 1, which is kind of a bummer, other than some like, again, like the one wall kind of feeling a little bit like the one in Hydro City. But in general, this is like very much based on the first two. That's also why it almost feels like a fairly like underwhelming sequel, because it only borrows from like a very small like portion of the series. That was very scary. Next up, it sounds like we have some cogs to deal with, which again is very, very Metropolis. These cogs animate really oddly. I almost feel like they're supposed to be moving at different speeds, but the animation just feels very choppy in a way that, like, even in like the modern versions of Sonic 2, I feel like the cogs actually animate more fluidly than these, oddly enough. I'm actually trying to think, would those have been out at this point? I don't think so. Because I want to say CD was 2011, so actually this would have preceded the mobile version of Sonic CD. And maybe it makes sense why they wanted to greenlight that project after something like this. But again, it does feel interesting to me how much Sonic games from this point on really tried to capitalize on nostalgia, and I do wonder how much something like New Super Mario Bros. Played a role in that, given that a lot of Sonic games since this have been criticized for being very derivative of both Sonic itself and also just other games. Like, obviously the comparisons with Frontiers speak for themselves at this point, and have been made multiple times, so I won't reiterate them here, but even like other Sonic games like Lost World and Colors with the gravity and space mechanics drew comparisons to Mario Galaxy, for example. So I kind of wonder if that was also the case for Sonic 4. Episode 1 is very interesting, honestly. I do wish it had more of its own identity. Even just having these same levels, but with different aesthetics, I feel would have helped a lot, actually. Because just having unique backgrounds, and not just immediately being like, oh, this is just Metropolis, that would have helped a lot. And that's actually something Episode 2 addresses, but again, we'll see that once we get through that. Episode 1 definitely felt like I was testing the waters for a retro throwback, and not necessarily successfully at that. But again, I almost feel like marketing matters, where if you call it a retro throwback and everyone knows that's what you're getting, then you accept that, and you kind of move on. But then when you try to pass it off as a sequel, and it's this derivative, then that's when the problem actually feels a lot more apparent. I do like some of the level design. In general, I do feel like I'm struggling less than I thought I would. Again, even though we did die quite a few times against the one boss and got tripped up by the torch puzzle a few times. In general, this has been a relatively straightforward playthrough. I don't want to speak too soon because I remember the ending of Sonic 4 being really cheap, so we'll have to see how that goes. Speaking of close calls, we had very little time to actually squeeze through that closing door. So yeah, in general, it's very interesting level design. Again, you have a lot of sequences like this where you just homing attack a chain of enemies, and you have the same little flying enemies every time. I almost feel like having different enemies would help, like so they weren't the exact same enemies. That would help to make it feel a little bit less like you're just using the homing attack chain on the exact same group every time. It would help to make it feel a little bit less redundant. We're actually going fast enough to dodge the enemies, which I'm very grateful for. You never know with these enemies. Again, these are like the worst part of Sonic 2, and they kind of are the worst part here, actually, so I guess that's not surprising. You have their reputation to uphold, after all.